Hello, everyone, and we are back now. We heard today already from the Finnish and the French example about the use of health data for research and development. And I'm here today at the next session. My pleasure is to introduce Dean Summerfield, who is the Senior VP of Real World and Commercial Solutions at IQVIA for EMEA. With over 25 years of professional service experience in biotech, medical devices, and pharmaceuticals, Dean oversees IQVIA's commercial and real-world services in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. He's responsible for collaborations with leading research sites and manages relationships with governments, institutions, payers, and healthcare providers across more than 60 countries. And Dean is here with us today to present the IQVIA's perspective on health data for clinical trials and real-world evidence. So we can now learn a bit more from the IQVIA experience. So Dean, welcome, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Carolina, and good afternoon or good morning to all on the call. And it's a pleasure to be here today, and it's a pleasure for IQVIA to be part of this excellent agenda and collaborate with the ECHAlliance. In the first three sessions this morning, we've heard a lot about the creation of compelling connected healthcare data and the multiple uses it can be used for from Finland, from France, and in collaboration with Novartis and other pharmaceutical companies. In this session, we're going to pivot a little, and we're going to look at the changing landscape of clinical research and the uses of data within clinical research and the uses of real-world evidence and the evolving demand that places and expectations it has on healthcare data. So start familiar challenges and issues that cut across the spectrum that have already been talked about in part in the sessions earlier. How we need better information and connected information to address the challenge of rising costs within the healthcare systems and manage delivering our goals and population health within the constrained budgets that we have. Because we want to be more evidence-based in our healthcare decision-making, but the different stakeholders within the network have different evidence needs for the decisions they're supporting. And we're trying to move to shorter and shorter timelines, whether that's in getting a new product into the market, approving it for clinical use, or making decisions in terms of clinical care. A lot of that pivots around what life sciences industries talk about real-world data, or colleagues in provider systems just talk about as clinical data. But we want to be able to collect that in a way that doesn't put extra burden on physicians and other healthcare individuals who are already hard-pressed to meet the demands upon them. And that need becomes earlier and earlier in product development, whether that's driving evidence-based decision-making, health technology assessments. I'm sure we'll talk about over the next couple of days, the forthcoming HTA legislation and the changes that will bring. And then we'll see the pivot towards the ultra-rare diseases, which require different forms of information, different forms of collecting data. For example, in a long-term 10, 15-year post-year safety follow-up with a rare or ultra-rare condition, the mechanisms, the tools that we used in large-scale diseases aren't really applicable. So how does technology and different ways of collecting data solve some of those problems? If we take the perspective of life sciences companies, and a key part of the organizations with whom IQVIA works are the life sciences companies, they're seeking high quality data, informed key decisions across the entire development to launch to maturation and post-LOE setting. And we've heard some examples in the sessions before. So whether that's informing trial design, whether that's getting patients into study, whether that's building the complementary evidence base for regulatory submission, or meeting those post-authorization safety and surveillance and effectiveness commitments, there's an increasing need for different sorts of information collected in a less burdensome way and in a more rapid fashion to be able to make better decisions. So I'm going to start at that end of the spectrum. I'm going to share some trends with respect to the clinical research landscape and what that's placing in terms of opportunity for provider systems and the research centers that are part of the ECHAlliance to participate in, and the expectations and demands that are coming from that changing pipeline. So let's start with a good news story. despite some of all the challenges we see in healthcare, the good news is that clinical trial investment continues to grow. Over the last decade, it's increased by over 40%. Last year, the top 15 large pharma organizations invested over $140 billion in the year in research and development, and that excludes the small and medium biotechs. But what you can see in this chart in front of you, with the light blue representing phase 1 or the traditional designs of early stage clinical development, and the dark blue representing the phase 2 or similar designs in green phase 3, is that growth has come in early stage trials, in looking at the new mechanisms of actions, mechanisms of action, looking at new forms, new modalities, looking at combinations of using products in multiple disease areas at once, which places new demands and new challenges in terms of information collection. But positive story is that the opportunity is there. And that opportunity, we often in many forums spend a lot of time, quite rightly, talking about oncology, the rise of precision oncology over the last decade, but that research increase has happened in all therapeutic areas. Yes, oncology still represents 2/3 of the pipeline with its own specific information needs and challenges. But now we see the next most research area is neurology, both the CNS and the psychiatric diseases. And I think that gives us a huge new opportunity. I've been in the industry long enough to remember the last large wave of neurological solutions that held so much promise in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and other disease areas. But our way of conducting clinical research and looking at our efficacy by only being able to record information as the patient presented in the healthcare giver didn't really give us a good understanding of the efficacy of those products in that condition where people have good days and bad days. But now with connected devices or things that many of us wear on our wrists or other pieces, and I've seen in the chat today, numerous other organizations offering a way of providing regulatory grade information in real time. We can study diseases, collect information about how well they work, what's good about them, and perhaps what's poor about them in a different way with the better data. We need that as we go into neurology. We need that in the new worlds of the cardiovascular and metabolic. And of course, in one that's top of mind for many healthcare players, whether at pharma side or payer side, provider side, the great advances we're making in areas such as obesity at the moment. The other piece that drives an increase in demand for newer forms of data is the resurgence or the rapid growth in advanced therapies, whether we're talking cell, gene, or RNA. This is now 15% of the trial pipeline. That need, therefore, to be able to connect the genomic data, or the test data, the diagnostic data to the clinical record in a consistent way, to be able to identify the appropriate patients and then follow the efficacy and the safety through that pattern. That's putting new demands on our use of healthcare data and the interoperability of healthcare data, which was talked about in the previous sessions and will be a key focus of sessions to come. The other thing that's changed a lot is the designs, and this was mentioned once or twice in the previous sessions this morning. Commercial clinical trials are trying to look at collecting information in multiple disease areas or multiple products in one disease area at once. The umbrella designs, basket trials, adaptive master protocols, all designed to try and reduce the clinical care burden, to advance the speed of clinical research, and to increase participation in clinical research. Again, now these designs represent almost a fifth of all clinical trials. They place additional constraints and additional requirements on healthcare systems and research centers that participate. And although, again, these are dominated in the oncology area, we see growth in infectious diseases, in CNS, in autoimmune diseases. So regardless of the specialty, regardless of the part of healthcare that different people representing the Alliance are working in, there's new opportunities to generate new forms of data and drive greater efficiency and effectiveness in clinical research. The other thing that's changed quite a lot in the last decade or more is the sponsor of commercial clinical research. So back 10, 15 years ago, the majority of commercial research came from the large pharmaceutical companies, some of whom have talked already this morning, and they are still significant investors in clinical research. But with that pivot of those disease areas we've talked about already, we've seen the emergence of the biotech, so the EBP, the emerging biotech companies. They are now the dominant sponsor of research, again, with it being pivoted to more early phase 1 and phase 2 type designs. They represent now 2/3 of the clinical development pipeline. And when they look at where to place clinical research, the designs they want to use in clinical research, the information they want to gather from the secondary uses of data versus primary data collection, there's quite a significant change over this period than what perhaps we'd seen at the start of the last decade or earlier stages. And as that's changed in terms of sponsor, we've also seen a global a start of a global shift in terms of the source of novel active substance. So the share of new innovation and new products and new drugs coming from the United States and has stayed relatively flat, increased slightly over the last decade. But what we have seen is China, and not just in products which are second, third, fourth generations of existing products, but truly novel and innovative therapies, tripling in the percentage of the global clinical research landscape over the last decade. And in proportion was European clinical research has stayed active and the origination, a share of innovation and new products has designed. So a challenge for us here, who are part of the ECHAlliance in Europe, to create an environment that stimulates early stage innovation in healthcare, particularly in the drug spectrum. Now, coming to the real pivot around data, what we have seen in this period is a very marked change and increase in the complexity of conducting commercial clinical research. So a lot of information on here, but what we've seen is participation in research particularly jumped up obviously during the COVID era as we were researching the COVID therapies and vaccines. But 2 years ago, we passed the threshold of having over 1 million participants in clinical trials globally. But during that period, because of the shift to the disease areas, because of that increase in early stage, what we're seeing is the amount of information needed to be collected in the trial, the endpoints that are there and the other information has increased 30 to 40%. Alongside that, participating in the trial, because we're looking for more information, we're looking at information in a more precise way, the eligibility to criteria, so the inclusion and the exclusion criteria has also increased by 25%. As a consequence, but also as a drive to get greater participation in a smaller number of sites to reduce the investment in clinical research, we've seen pharmaceutical companies progressively looking to conduct their research in fewer countries and in fewer sites. So although this has made the participation in commercial research perhaps more challenging for even the largest research hospitals, we work extensively with IQVIA works with over 150,000 research institutions across the globe. But even with the largest and the most prolific in commercial research, they're all struggling with the complexity in clinical trials. So the question becomes, how can we start to reduce that? And you can take our word for it, but we can also look at the recent Tufts report that says some of the drivers of that challenge is in trial durations. It's taking longer, and in particular, it's taking longer to initiate a study. And the single biggest driver of that is the ability to be sure that one can identify sufficient patients meeting that criteria to participate in the study. But today's mechanisms still rely in many countries on manual investigation of clinical research records, whether they're in electronic form, but in some countries still in paper form. So surely there's a better application of technology. We've heard some examples this morning that can connect that and reduce that study time, and to find the patients who meet the more complex eligibility criteria in a faster way. Now, if that's looking at the perspective from early stage clinical research, what we've also seen, driven by the regulators, whether in the US, Europe from the EMEA, MHRA, and other regulators around the world, is that the reuse of secondary healthcare data, again, real world evidence from the perspective of the life sciences industry, is an increasing part of regulatory submission. And we're just showing on this page an example over the last 20 years or so of the increasing number of FDA approvals on novel active substances on which real-world evidence has formed a major part of the regulatory submission. And there's different types, and we've heard some of them being talked about in the earlier sessions. So the ability to see what happens in the progression of a disease without the intervention, the so-called natural history. If we're in a rare condition, if we're trying to treat a pediatric population or a very sick population, it's inappropriate, obviously, and unethical to put them on an ineffective therapy. So we don't want to have that control arm coming from the control arm coming from primary data collection. We want to better understand the natural history through secondary data. The increase in registries has been talked about this morning, and we've got other sessions this afternoon beyond that are a big driver that collect that out of information. And also then, how do you expand the use of an approved therapy into other indication in a more effective way by using information that we have from clinical use to expand the access through expanded access protocols. So that demand for better connected healthcare information across multiple disease areas is being driven by regulators. But it's also being driven by the payer decision makers. Here's just an example. In many of these novel disease areas, in rare conditions, orphan conditions, we're obviously conducting single-arm studies with just one active arm, no control arm. In that last 5-10 years, therefore, the use of external comparators, so looking at the control arm from secondary healthcare data, has increased quite dramatically. Yes, that demand jumping in oncology, but as you can see, the single-arm data trial submissions to health technology bodies across the world are in lots and lots of different disease areas. So our initiatives to look at the more advanced uses of connected healthcare data to advance clinical research should be focused on oncology, and we've got wonderful things like the cancer mission and other aspects. But as we look at EHDS, we need to look across all disease areas and how we can bring information in primary disease conditions, infectious diseases, as well as those more acute care settings. Now, something where better data really has to play a part, that's important to everyone involved in clinical development and research, is increasing diversity. And diversity has multiple dimensions. We have diversity in the early stage, where we want to really understand the deep science based on epidemiological differences, underlying biological and the connection between the genotype and the phenotype and the different biological responses in those settings. So we need to know more in the early stages, hopefully in silico settings. So using that better secondary collected data for early stage clinical research before we go first in human is a vital way to get better products developed in early stage, but also get better participation and diversity. Of course, when we move into confirmatory pivotal trials, we want to be representative of the disease population, which means to the extent that we're allowed to under regulations, we need to identify those differences. We want to ensure equitable access. So the greater emergence of research as a clinical care option. Last week was met with researchers in Poland and discussing this very point about how the participation in research provides different options for different people, and that's a conversation that goes on around the region. And of course, we want to understand better the response and the safety in subpopulations, but without producing that person. And we've heard today already about tracking use in medicines in subpopulations post-authorizations. So from a pharmaceutical company point of view, we did some research saying when you're looking at placing your clinical research and placing those significant investments around the world, what drives the decision? So this is research conducted with clinical development senior researchers in both large, mid, and small biopharma companies. Of course, do you have the patient population is underpins this, but there's three major buckets that they look for. First of all, what's your fact base in being able to deliver clinical research at speed and quality? So you set up an activation times. Can you identify and recruit those patients, contract in, and start the research in a timely fashion, and then keep them on there? Can you meet this diversity, that diversity agenda? Can you do that in the rare disease setting? And are you able to use different forms of digitization, decentralized technologies, remote monitoring, other capabilities to deliver against that time without reducing quality in research? The second aspect is can you bring the insight? So with biotech companies now dominate, perhaps with fewer key opinion leaders, medics in their own organizations, are looking for healthcare systems to be able to provide that insight and advice, and also the advocacy from patient organizations and being able to support. And we will hear from patient organizations later today and tomorrow on their role in promoting clinical research. But also to the systems value innovation, and we heard it from the French session before, how the information is being used to speed registration approval policies and do you support innovative design. A lot of that is proven and demonstrated and executed by better connected information, which is why we and other players are so excited by the potential of the European health data space and its objectives, and the other policies, the AI Act, because they all are able to drive the advancement of Europe and other countries around the world in the use of secondary use of data for clinical research. So today, this morning already, later on today and tomorrow, we'll talk more about the various initiatives. Of course, the Act-EU to specifically focus on clinical trial, the EU health data space, the applications of the AI Act in healthcare, the proving that secondary uses can meet large-scale purposes through the Darwin EU initiative. This is a non-exhaustive list of initiatives, but there's a lot going on as Europe is really looking to reverse the trend and go back to being that powerhouse of clinical research across the globe as it once was. But these diverse collaborations are not just to address the situations in Western Europe and developed countries. There are great collaborations to address the global health challenge. Levin and Carolina talked this morning about the African initiative and the ECHAlliance work in Africa. It's an area that IQVIA is significantly active in. Whether it's in infectious diseases, in non-infectious diseases, looking at antimicrobial resistance across the world, or even preparing for the next pandemic in terms of the CEPI or related initiatives to ensure we've got an ever-warm system to address the next major global challenge we face. Better information, a better connected healthcare data system is pivotal in being able to meet these objectives. So it's our belief as an organization that what we need to do is be able to connect research sites, to be able to connect across countries, to be able to integrate that information. In doing so, you'll be able to create a healthcare data system which is not just going to allow clinical and real-world research to advance more quickly, but the same underlying data, the same data set, the same data warehouse or lake can be used to address operational questions and challenges and opportunities in the efficiency of delivering clinical care and make better clinical care decision makers. For too long, we've looked at pulling data together to address clinical research as a separate problem from the information we use to run the efficiency of the hospital and that we use to inform clinical care decision making. The improvement in technology, the ambitions that have been talked about already this morning, will be talked about in the rest of the conference, all address to creating one connected data set to be able to do that, all things at once. So what I want to leave you with is, if that's the opportunity in front of us, what we've addressed a little bit this morning, we'll talk about in subsequent sessions, including the perspectives of some of the health ministers later, is the challenges that we've got to work together to solve. So how do we combine those fractured data sets? How do we pull the valuable information out of the unstructured data? Many of us are using electronic medical systems whose data design was developed 20 years ago. So we've got a lot of the richness is sitting in unstructured data, using natural language processing, perhaps using other approaches. We want to extract that value, we want to connect the system. But also, how do we ensure that how France puts its data model together, we can combine that with information from Finland, from Germany, from the USA, from Canada, by at least looking at common elements in data models. OMOP is talked about a lot. OMOP is a fantastic data model, but it was designed for certain uses, and is that the right standard, or do we need to evolve that? Changing regulatory compliance, addressing the issues of compliance and data privacy in an ever-changing environment. And also the distrust. I heard it in the last couple of weeks in talking about the application of AI in healthcare, so much promise, but even we're talking with a leading UK researcher last Friday, he was saying that he has to overcome the distrust of the black boxes amongst his peers when they're looking at information provided to improve clinical decision making, where the underlying advice was generated by AI and they don't understand. And the final point that I know will be tackled in later sessions is looking at the value chain. How the people who have invested in developing the information, collecting the information, curating, making it available, what's the value exchange there, and how is that appropriately met? So in conclusion, it's our belief, and I'm passionate in supporting ECHAlliance and other people on this organization, because as long as we collaborate effectively, we can unleash this tremendous potential of healthcare data to accelerate clinical research, to meet those demands and get these better products to patients in a more rapid fashion, and ultimately to improve patient outcomes. Thanks very much, Glenn, and thank you, Carolina.
Thank you so much, Dean, for this excellent presentation and an overview. We have at least 4 questions and just a couple of minutes. So if you allow me, I will pick some and let's see how many we can take. I know that
I'll try and be brief in my answers.
Yeah, I know from Bladen that we can go a bit over time. We'll try to save it later. So first question, I will start from the end, actually. Given the importance of the interoperability in healthcare, as already mentioned, how is IQVIA contributing to or navigating efforts to standardize health data formats for seamless exchange and collaboration?
So it's in 2 ways. First of all, we actively participate in the various initiatives that are already exist. I think nobody can run independent work. So I think Eden was mentioned earlier, the OCTI community, all these different ways are participating in TIRDAS as we look at the European health data space. What IQVIA wants to do is participate in the already existing forums and ensure that we can contribute our expertise. And we'd ask the same of other organizations here. Let's get together in the existing forums that exist rather than trying to create new ones, because we've all looking at it through a slightly different lens, but that's what we do. We also look to invest and stimulate. So we run sponsored initiatives in oncology and other areas where we try to encourage different leading research hospitals to gather together to do proof of concepts on how we use secondary healthcare data, perhaps to do a real world oncology study, but federating the information across 15, 20 hospitals across Europe. But predominantly it's through participating in existing forums and bringing our expertise in.
Thank you. And then from that, I will move to the first question that we received from the audience that was actually on the to look for your comment on the data model. What is your view on the importance of the digital therapeutics? Just a second. Right. What is your view on the importance of digital therapeutics as a real competition and potential threat for the current big pharma business model, focusing on the NCEs and NBEs?
I would never see anything. I would never see anything that provides a better solution to a patient as a threat. Okay, we know patients respond in different ways. So digital therapeutics are a vitally important advance in giving different therapeutic options. Pharmacological intervention works in many cases, but not in all. Some cases, the complementary use of digital therapeutics, allows better patient outcomes. So apologies to the questioner, but I don't actually see it as a threat. I think anything which provides greater efficiency, and digital therapeutics are very cost effective in many cases. So that issue of improving patient outcomes at lower cost. When my very first opening statement, it was about battling against the rising cost of meeting healthcare demand. So I see them as complementary to that. And from a payer and provider and healthcare system point of view, all we need to ensure is that we set the same standards and evaluate them fairly, and also look at mechanisms. Some of the digital therapeutics have struggled for reimbursement, because we have mechanisms that reimburse drugs. Sometimes we don't have mechanisms that effectively reimburse digital therapeutics, and that reduces the innovation for these complementary solutions. substitute.
Thank you for raising this issue. Actually, tomorrow we have a session on the reimbursement model, so I already
You can pay me
invite
later,
everyone.
Caroline.
Yeah, everyone invite that. And just last question to close this session. What is IQVIA's perspective on patient-powered research networks, which are very successful, led by large patient organizations like, for example, COPD Foundation in the US?
We are an active collaborator and support the greater participation and shaping of the patient voice in clinical research. Well, perhaps more established and more active in the US, as you've said. I think the European Patient Forum is talking at some point during this meeting. They've got a strong active voice in that area, but also the individual disease areas. One of the reasons we have low participation, one of the reasons we have higher dropout, is that research is not designed sufficiently with what life is like to participate in research for the individual patient or participant. The patient associations, can provide vital input into that, and we collaborate with our sponsors in gaining that insight much earlier in design. And the stronger the patient voice is in the design of clinical research, in finding participants for clinical research, that means more people will participate. By demystifying it, the better. So we actively support and think that's a vital component to address some of the opportunities and challenges we've already talked about today.
Thank you so much, Dean, for this excellent presentation. We need to close this session, and so thank you, and for being with us. And after a short break, I will hand over to my colleague Bladen Rees, who will moderate the next block on the health data sharing perspective from industry, including software and technology service providers. So thank you all for staying with us, and after the short break, we come back with the new guests here. Thank you.